Hi there, I'm Simon Roberts. I'm the head brewer at West Brewery in Glasgow. I've been here a little bit over 8 years, and before working in brewing, I trained and worked for a short time as an analytical chemist. I'm going to spend the next 50 or so minutes with you. I'm going to give you a sort of outline of the history of West, sort of our story to date, and then take you through 3 different beer tastings. I've selected 3 beers that hopefully highlight different beer styles, sort of flavour profiles, as well as ingredients and processes, so we can sort of dial into the technical aspects of brewing as well. The story of West really begins with our founder and owner, Petra Wetzel. Petra came as a school child to Scotland and really loved her time here. She remembered the country as being very welcoming and beautiful. So when it came time for her to leave Germany to study abroad, that kind of stuck with her, and she decided she wanted to go back to Scotland. So she arrived at Glasgow University in 1993 to study law, if I remember correctly. And it was the next year, on one of her father's visits, so 1994, that the seed for West Brewery really was planted. Herbert, Petra's father, was out for dinner somewhere in the West End and ordered a local beer, and he wasn't exactly enamoured with what he got, and was then further sort of shocked to find there wasn't a tremendous amount of other alternatives available, sort of locally brewed, which is in real quite stark contrast to what you would expect to find in Germany. So the beer culture, certainly at the time, in Scotland and the UK and Ireland, was very different to Germany. So each area, each region of Germany will have a few sort of very successful regional brewers, and then lots of smaller breweries in each of the sort of towns and cities. People will tend to drink locally from those sort of regional brewers, and also most areas are quite often associated quite strongly with a specific beer style that'll be very, very common. So if you go to Kolsch, you'll get a Köln, Düsseldorf, Altbier, Leipzig, you'll get Gosse. Bavaria, southern Germany, where the Wetzel family are from, very, very strongly associated with Hefeweizen, the unfiltered wheat beer, and Helles, the sort of golden lager. We'll try both of those today. So yeah, that sort of experience at dinner was the first time that Petra thought maybe this sort of German methods or system or culture of beer drinking and brewing was possibly better, and that there was certainly room in her entrepreneurial mind anyway, that kind of brewery and that kind of ethos and philosophy could strive and thrive in Glasgow. So some years later, her and her partner at the time basically started putting together a business plan, and the idea then was to have a German style beer hall with a beer garden, which is really important in German bars, and that there would be a little microbrewery underneath that would supply the beer hall. Now, we've kind of grown quite a lot since then, and in 2016 we started commissioning a new production facility. You can't really see it great, but it's behind me. So we went from 1,500 litre brewery that could produce 2 to 4 at a real push times a week to a 3,000 litre brew capacity, and we could brew 4 times a day, almost 24/7 if pushed. So we are, as I said, a German style brewery. And what does that mean? Well, it means that for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, we brew German style beers. But what does keep us authentic, what keeps us German at heart, is that we brew all our beers to the German purity law, or the Reinheitsgebot. So that was it was the world's oldest food purity law. So it originated in the late 1400s, finally becoming law in Bavaria in 1516, and it has went under numerous changes, and still does currently, to keep it sort of relevant and up to date. The original purity law, the Reinheitsgebot, basically stipulated that you can only use 3 ingredients, so malted barley, water, and hops. Couldn't use anything else for brewing. Now, obviously they were utilising yeast, but at the time they didn't quite know it yet. So it wasn't until 1857 when French cytomologist Louis Pasteur came along and proved that not only was yeast living, but it was the responsible organism for fermentation for the production of ethanol. Obviously, we do now use yeast as an integral ingredient in the brewing process to make beer. As I've already alluded to, we also create a wheat beer that wouldn't have been allowed under the original Reinheitsgebot. So what does the Reinheitsgebot mean to us day to day now? Well, it's a great USP, and it also means that it was a great place for me to learn brewing, because I can only use the 4 sort of key ingredients. I can't use anything else. You know, we can't chuck in table salt or coriander seed or chocolate or oysters or any other mad things, or fruits or coffee or whatever it might be that's in vogue to put in beer. We can't do that. We have to just stick to water, malt, hops and yeast. That's it, nothing else. The other things that are sort of stipulated that we have to stick to are that our wheat beers, any that we produce, have to be at least 50% malted wheat in the grist bill, in the grain bill. All of our lagers have to be 100% malted barley. Basically, what it means is, if we want to make something that little bit more interesting, that little bit more bold or characterful, off-piste, then really we have to understand all the principles underlying the brewing process, because we need to work out what levers to pull and manipulate to get the final product that we're after. So I'll just take you sort of quickly through our sort of main steps in the brew days, and yeah, we'll give you a quick overview, and what I'll try and do is sort of go into those a bit more in depth with each beer, and I'll talk about the specific ingredients and the processes, the manipulation there that's went into creating that product. So first thing that we deal with when either conceiving a beer, writing a recipe, or just on the brew day itself, is always the malt, the grain, the cereal. So that's a carbohydrate source, obviously, that drives the fermentation profile, but as well as the sugar to create ethanol and carbon dioxide, you also here have a huge potential for sort of colour, aroma, flavour. It's a real strong foundation, real big backbone of the final product. So there's a huge array of different types of malts that we can use, so we can only use cereals that can be and have been malted. The 2 cereals that we would most commonly use would be, by far and away, barley, the most used, wheat, but we have also used smaller volumes, amounts of sort of malted oats. We have done 2 beers in my time here with malted rye, and each of those different cereals have different characteristics that adds different sort of aspects to the beer. So oats, for example, you might add in sort of new, popular, in vogue style of New England IPA, and adds a sort of rounded mouthfeel. And more traditionally, they would have been used in very British styles of beer, sort of oatmeal stouts, so big, sort of unctuous, thick brews. Rye that I mentioned, for example, can add sort of a light, sort of peppery, sort of white pepper type flavour, and it can be quite nice if used sort of intelligently and sparingly. But within each sort of species of cereal, type of cereal, you can also process those cereals very differently. The main thing really would be the heat treatment to dry them out. So basically, the higher the temperature and the longer they're treated at a temperature to dry them out, to leave them sort of suitable for storage in the brewery, there's sort of more of a Maillard reaction that happens. The darker the colour of the cereal itself, sort of the darker the colour lends itself to the beer, and the more of the sort of vanilla-like sweetness that we'd get. You can sort of continue that process through, and you'll get more sort of light caramel, dark caramel, burnt caramel, and you can continue that right through, and you'll end up starting to get really dark, rich roasted flavours, eventually ending up with sort of milk chocolate, dark chocolate, coffee, right up into really high dark roasted French coffee, and eventually even into like sort of burnt toast sort of flavour. So That's the first thing we have to conceive and think about when conceiving the recipe. And on the brew day, once your recipe sort of set firm in place, the first thing you do with that malt is get it together and mill it. So milling is basically, same as in bakery, is just breaking open the husk, breaking that husk away from the endosperm where the carbohydrate source is within the grain. Once you've got your grist, that's the name for the charge of cereal for that day. Once you've got your grist milled, we're on to the next step. So mashing is the next step, and it's effectively, I suppose, kind of making a big watery porridge. So we're adding water at a specific temperature to the cereal, and the purpose of the mash is effectively to turn the starches in the cereals into fermentable sugars. Now, there's a number of different enzymes within the mash that we can utilize, but predominantly the saccharification happens with two enzymes, beta and alpha amylase. So they're breaking basically down the big starch molecules into fermentable sugars, and you can utilize those in different ways to create different finishes. So the more you would use beta amylase, which is snipping maltose enzymes off the end of the starch, the more you use that, the sort of drier, the more fermentable that you're...
St Mungo is the flagship beer of West. I always say, if you don't like St Mungo, you and I will never be friends, because it's the beer I would take to my desert island. It's the beer that if I could only drink one beer for the rest of my days, that's the beer I would drink. It's a 4.9% lager. At 4.9, actually, your brain equates taste to alcohol at its optimum. So anything weaker than 4.9, your brain might go, well, that's not maybe as, you know, full-bodied as it should be, but anything higher, your brain kind of slightly gets overpowered with the alcohol. So we think that 4.9 is the optimum level of alcohol for any beer. And it's a hybrid between a Helles, which is the style of Bavaria, and a Pils, which is the style in northern Germany. It's got a beautiful color, and I prefer it out of a tankard with a handle, which means that the beer doesn't get warm as I hold the glass. And as I said, it's just the stuff of dreams. It is pure heavenly lager.
3 different German hops, one for bittering and 2 very traditional German hops for flavour. We're getting some light citrus fruits, just general hop flavours, but they're not there to dominate, they're not there to push through, they're there to work in harmony with the malt and just to leave a really enjoyable, drinkable beer. 4.9% is a bit premium, it's a bit stronger, it gives us a bit of character, it lets us stand out from the crowd potentially, but it's not so strong that it's going to put you off or mean you can't really sit and enjoy it with a few with a meal, or, you know, before the big game or on the way to concert or whatever it might be.
GPA stands for German Pale Ale. So in Germany there's a beer called Kölsch, which is only allowed to be brewed in Cologne. And our GPA is a slightly, you know, it's a take on Kölsch. And it's a 5.2, so it's a slightly stronger. It's an ale, so like we brew mostly lagers, but GPA is an ale. It's a really fresh, slightly hoppy, but not too hoppy, because a lot of people drink IPAs these days, but a lot of IPAs are really overly hopped. This is a really lovely balanced beer. And I think beer needs to be all about the balance. It's not about having a really strong or a really dark or a really hoppy beer. It's about the balance, and only when a beer is balanced do you really appreciate drinking it.
It's got big bitter hops at the start, and then it's left with sort of modern new world hop flavours. So we've got a lot of sort of grapefruit and pithy lemon and these sorts of in vogue hop flavours at the moment. Again, brewed to the Reinheitsgebot, and it must have a nod to Germany. So it's a balance of German and American hops. So we're getting the big bold lemon hits from American hops, but we're still keeping the sort of slightly more traditional German flavour notes from hops from the Hallertau in Germany, which is the biggest hop growing region in the world.
Heidi Weisse was named after my golden retriever Heidi. She sadly died, and we basically wanted to come up with an homage to her. She was very much a loved brewery dog for over a decade at West. It's a 5.2 wheat beer. It's cloudy, so it's unfiltered. It's got all the goodness. I always say to men who are losing their hair, they should be drinking it because it's full of nutrition. It's good for your fingernails and your skin. It's got an aroma of cloves and bananas and citrus. It's 64% wheat beer. It's a smashing summer drink. I have to say it's probably the drink of choice of most of our front of house team and the chefs, and these guys know their beer, so if anybody likes wheat beer, I would dare them to not like Heidi Weisse.
This one is less about balance and it's more geared towards the flavours that the yeast creates. So it's a very specific yeast that's used, and it creates lots of fruity flavours called isoamyl acetate. It's banana-like flavours. It's the thing that's used to make banana foam sweeties taste the way they do. And there's also some light spice, clovey flavours in there. So this one's all about those big banana and light clove accentuated flavours, and it's really a bit different. If you haven't tried a wheat beer, it's a bit of an assault on the senses, and it's really, really delicious.